agradeço mais uma vez e digo que é uma honra ter a missão, né, de organizar exatamente a 30ª Semana IPPUR diante de tudo que vocês falaram, né, carregando aí esse legado e fazendo o máximo para a gente manter a instituição viva, tanto na sua tradição, como bem falou o Fred, mas também nas possibilidades de inovação, né? Então essa é uma preocupação da comissão organizadora da 30ª Semana IPPUR, né? Então mais uma vez agradecê-los. E, enfim, depois eu vou fazer uma fala aí de fato, né, um pouco mais protocolar, de encerramento após a fala do Patrick, né, e de vários agradecimentos que a gente tem que fazer, mas sem mais delongas, agora a gente passa para o professor Patrick Bond, da Universidade de Joanesburgo, para nos brindar com a palestra de encerramento da 30ª Semana IPPUR, né, e acho que teremos aí um complemento muito interessante diante de tudo que vimos ao longo da semana, desde a palestra de abertura do professor Simone, na segunda-feira. Mais uma vez agradecer o Padre Conte por vir de Joanesburgo até aqui para fazer essa fala, né? Sabemos da agenda e das dificuldades, e então, mais uma vez agradecê-lo pela gentileza de vir até aqui.
Thank you. I want to test these wonderful interpreters with two words. Amandla, aware to. I don't know. I mean power to the people. But now, after Carlos, I have a new two words for you. Amandla, IPPUR. Amandla, IPPUR. So we will have to get you used to that when you visit us in South Africa. We have learned so much, and now with translation with people, we will learn more. This is a book from 2022, and this is also English language from Marini in 1965 and 1972. So we were not yet ready to learn all of the new ideas that so many have been developing, especially in Reorient. I think this special issue, now I can take it through deeper and understand all of the ways you are bringing back a very creative dependency theory, especially looking at the dependent city. That was a wonderful effort, which is incomprehensible to me so far, but one day Deepo will help when it's online. I think the crucial point here is we are exploring, with the new translation, we are exploring why, as Vijay Prashad says, Marini returns to us with stiletto-sharp Marxist analysis of dependency. Now, this is interesting because Vijay has a different position than what I will now talk about. A position about Brazilian and South African and BRICS sub-imperialism. For Vijay and his comrades at Tricontinental, including in São Paulo, I don't believe there is sub-imperialism. You might want to look at his booklet last year. Hyper-imperialism. There is no sub-imperialism. Israel, come on, Saudi Arabia. Well, Ana Garcia, who's at Federal Rural, was at Puch and BRICS Policy Center, began to teach me about the dependent urbanization when we worked together on the Rio port. It's something you all know much better. But we thought there was a big story, a macro geopolitical story that uses Marxism. So we gathered many great comrades in our book, BRICS, the anti-capitalist reader. But we found especially important were these relationships between the most unequal regions of the world. We found that our cities, Johannesburg and Cape Town, are even more unequal than Rio and Sao Paulo, but they're all four in the top 10 This is using the Palmer index, top 10 to bottom 40% from Euromonitor. And we can track the internal uneven development of urban and rural and our regions increasingly clearly, and find an extraordinary role after apartheid. Unlike Brazil, where Lula and the minimum wage and Bolsa Familia, all of these programs that your urban social movements fought for, your labor movements, your feminist movements, these in South Africa were not strong enough. And one reason was government corruption. Now, this is a very interesting question, isn't it? How corrupt is South Africa? Well, compared to Brazil, about the same. We are the 82nd most least corrupt and the 98th most corrupt if we use Transparency International. And the people that they are measuring, if we do class analysis, a petty bourgeois and a bureaucratic bourgeois. But if we use race analysis, the people they're measuring are black. And unfortunately, there was much more corruption after our liberation in 1994, in the period especially under President Mandela, 96 to 99. But this is nothing. Being the 98th most corrupt out of 180 does not compare to what PwC has discovered. Every 2 years, they have an economic crime and fraud survey. And usually, South African capitalists, and yeah, let's do race analysis, yeah, they're like this, pink. And they win, usually, but now we're tied for second. Mumbai and Shanghai and Johannesburg are in the same league. What's going on? More corruption, more bribery, especially at the senior levels of capital in these cities. So I think this is very important because when we look at Johannesburg, we look at our central business district and our edge cities, Sandton, Midrand, Rosebank, Melrose Arch, Centurion. That's the Johannesburg, Pretoria, white bourgeoisie. They're the best in the world. Number one, world fraud champs during the 2010s. 8 out of 10 managers commit economic crime. Also Stellenbosch in Cape Town, in Durban, Umhlanga. So it's a very interesting way to think about our cities, about primitive accumulation that's being organized through systemic theft. The most systemic theft, okay, Portuguese, Bartholomew Dias, 1488, Vasco da Gama, 1497. They stole black bodies. In 1652, the first multinational corporation, Dutch East India Company, stole the land, which is now Cape Town. The leader was, in fact, a convicted criminal, Jan van Riebeck. We go forward to the stealing of the most important wealth source in Africa, non-renewable natural resources. Diamonds by Cecil Rhodes with the City of London in 1870s. And then came the most important of all. Underneath where I live, Johannesburg, half of the world's historic gold. We had also lots of coal nearby, and then we could have steel and petrochemicals. And today, 85% of the world's platinum. This is all within 2 hours. Underneath Johannesburg, half of the world's historic gold. But today, in my house in Johannesburg, okay, you were in Melville, petit bourgeois, bohemian suburb. What would it be like? It's like where you live, Carlos. What's the name of it? Yours? Okay, so this is the sort of equivalent. At night, I turn on my water and it doesn't work because the leaks in our water system are so severe that if they have the reservoir turned on at night, it all leaks out, and in the morning nothing is left. So they just turn it off at night because they're not fixing water pipes, as simple as that. That is the unequal ecological exchange which made London rich and Johannesburg the source of half the world's historic gold. unable to keep the water pipes on. So we have a problem of a dependent urbanization traceable to cities. But then in the 1930s, in Brazil and in Johannesburg, we had some manufacturing. Andre Gunnar Frank taught us, indeed, that when the North was in the Depression, well, you can de-link, you can have more of your own import substitution. And that meant that by the early 90s, Brazil and South Africa had very high rates of manufacturing GDP. South Africa about 21, Brazil 24. But now we go into the neoliberal era, and that means, which we'll look at in a moment, deindustrialization and reprimarization. Same thing in both, and indeed China, we're talking some bricks here, China falling because it over-accumulated and had to balance out with non-manufacturing activities like urban infrastructure. We thought the BRICS would help with this overall problem of dependency, didn't we? Latouf did. Oh, I did. Did you? Carlos, you did. We thought the BRICS would take on US imperialism. And this hope persists. So there's two international lefts that I see. One is pro-BRICS, one is a little more skeptical. One thinks that the BRICS are anti-imperialist. Some of us think the BRICS are sub-imperialist. Let's explore that. We have in Johannesburg, like you did in November last year here, the G20. So what's going on? We would say that the G20 is a reflection of imperial G7 and sub-imperial BRICS coming together since 2008 as the leaders. They began in 1999 as finance ministers when Brazil and South Africa and Russia and many middle-income countries were in financial crisis. And then 2008, the big global capitalist crisis where the G7 needed the BRICS, especially China and also a few others, Saudi Arabia, Korea with large surpluses. They needed their money. They needed quantitative easing, coordinated. They needed global Keynesianism. And again in 2020 with COVID, the lockdowns, the crashing of global supply chains, and different kinds of social resistances meant the G20 was a crucial coordinating function for bailing out mostly Western capital. There are contradictions. Marini talks of the antagonistic cooperation that you find, that he saw, of Brazilian capital against Western capital occasionally. And this will increase now because the BRICS are expanding so quickly, maybe too quickly to digest. And that means when in 2009 they really began, South Africa joined in 2010. 2023 in the Johannesburg summit, the new members were Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, not sub-imperial, and the UAE, loyal sub-imperial. And then in 2025, we've had Indonesia. So we have 10. And Lula and Salsa Amarim think that Saudi Arabia is part of the BRICS. Russia says, no, they're frozen. They're not. It's confusing. And then we have also partners that came in the Kazan summit. And you can see many new countries that are offered. Well, Argentina was offered in 2023, and Milei declined. But we have Bolivia. Maybe things will change with their new government. Cuba. We have Uganda, Nigeria. Algeria, not so sure. Turkey, not sure. Vietnam is now, yes, in, along with Thailand and Malaysia. Oh, these are very important countries, no question. But this could be a coherent, forceful bloc that can make multipolarism a reality. The G20 we're finding in Johannesburg, like you did in Rio, is very difficult to manage, to get anything concrete through. And you had Joe Biden in the G1, and now there's Donald Trump. We might come back to the Donald Trump question. What does paleo conservatism, the isolationism and xenophobia, and destruction of multilateral institutions. So now the G20 has as a tokenistic member the African Union, but basically it still remains imperial powers in the G7 and had Korea, and then the semi-imperial blocks, which means we should think of how Marini developed this idea initially. There were people like Lenin talked about small imperialism, but I think it's this idea that after the 1964 coup, some countries become the key nations, not within imperialism, but in the assistance of the expansion, a key nation. And this is especially easy for countries who've reached a stage of monopoly finance capitalism. Countries whose own internal markets, especially in big cities, have limits because of the traditions of super exploitation, paying workers less than the cost of their social reproduction, finding all kinds of techniques, especially migrant labor and political repression, to keep wages low. Marini was a genius in the book The Dialectics of Dependency in identifying these processes. And I think they go back to one of our greatest thinkers in the Marxist tradition, who allowed us to step outside a closed circuit of capital in Das Kapital, in which there was only a capitalist sector, capital and labor, without an exploration of capitalist relations with the non-capitalists. It's there, as Luxemburg said, that the capitalist penetrates through imperialism and eats up the non-capitalists and takes from societies and nature those aspects that are not commodified. And this is crucial to the accumulation of capital during crises, and that's when the imperialist incentive, especially 1870s crisis, 1890s crisis that she had witnessed, leads to things like 1885 Berlin Conference on Africa. But if we fast forward, the next big crises, 1930s, and then the 1970s. And my own PhD supervisor, David Harvey, discovered how rich Luxemburg's framework was in his book, The New Imperialism, and found that the over-accumulation crises for Luxemburg, she called it overproduction. So the over-accumulation crises could be partially displaced over space and time. You could find fixes, you could move capital around, but not enough. And when you did that, you found that the areas of the world economy, what we would call a semi-periphery, or the World Systems School, used to absorb surplus capitals from the West that had over-accumulated. They had produced too much, their capacity was too high, unemployment was high, financialization had begun to displace the capital away from productive circuits into financial circuits for high short-term returns. And at that point, again, 2008 becomes crucial during the world financial crisis. Then a network of sub-imperialisms arrive, and they're also trying to address the overaccumulation locally by finding strategies, the most famous, the Belt and Road Initiative, to move their capital. We find that they can therefore utilize multilateral imperialist institutions, because as Samir Amin wrote, you have capitalism in the BRICS working with two legs, and one is the problem that they are still wedded to neoliberalism. You'll see that from your Rio de Janeiro BRICS leaders' declaration on July 6th, in just a minute. But they also like the political resistance. They like to talk left against imperialist power and excessive activities and coups and control. But until they can learn to walk on both legs, not just on the economic leg to the right and the political leg to the left, they will not go anywhere. And he uses South Africa in his posthumous, he died in 2018, in his posthumous autobiography, he says that in South Africa after apartheid, nothing changed. Well, that's not true. Racism as an official ideology changed. But economically, we are still under the thumb of the Anglo mining monopolies. And we are, South Africa, in Africa, a semi-peripheral power. I think because Zimbabwean Sam Moyo worked with the Greek-Brazilian parasieros in Zimbabwe to say, well, look, this is obviously the case. Lots of different faces. I think they worked out, Gaudiano said there are 1,000 faces of semi-imperialism. And they found especially a schizophrenia in talking left and walking right, including in military relations. Paris is at the ABC. The Rio summit confirms this schizophrenia. Lots of critique, especially of Donald Trump, without saying his name, too frightened, in the Rio Declaration, July 6th. But they do move to the neoliberal agenda again, which they do every year, and promote the World Trade Organization and the international commercial system. They promote the IMF. And in this particular statement, it's very disturbing to me because I know what they did in 2015. 10 years ago, they were trying to get more money into the IMF. So the Chinese increased their voting share by 37%. Brazil by 23, India by 11, Russia by 8. So they're saying we must do this again, another increase, the 16th revision of quotas. And they're saying even though we cannot change the distribution of power in the IMF, we should all be spending more money on the IMF. Now when they did that before, the countries that lost the most were Venezuela. Okay, this was the 2015 Venezuela, even 2013, the last year of Chavez when they were planning. Nigeria, even South Africa lost 26%, but Venezuela and Nigeria lost 41% of their voting because the BRICS, or BRIC countries at least, including Brazil, took more power at IMF. Now, do we know Paulo Batista Nogueira? We know this fantastic, dynamic, former Lula-era representative from Brasilia to the IMF. And you know what he says about the IMF. I think we have a funny word in English, I don't know what it translates, but it's international motherfuckers. That is, they really support us, and they have never stopped, even with all of the new BRICS members having a greater share. In fact, they've become even more predatory and brutal. Batista will say the same about the BRICS New Development Bank, which he was serving as the vice president. And I think it goes to the strategy. The most sophisticated neoliberal and neoconservative representative of imperialism in the last decades certainly is Barack Obama. And he was asked by The Economist about China. The big question of our times is, do we have them inside or outside? And Barack Obama said, yes, we need, it is the right question. What do we do with China? He says, we need to bring them inside. And as they move up the value chain, and are not simply a low-wage construction and manufacturing site, and they believe in their own rights of intellectual property, they will join us as full-fledged capitalists in the imperial system. Now, we saw the one crisis that revealed some of this in COVID-19. Bolsonaro said, whatever the international drug companies want, we go with. But Narendra Modi, who is managing the world's, what's called the pharmacy of the third world, the generic industry. South Africa, which had a great fight to get AIDS medicines, just as Brazilians taught us, even Sarah, in the health minister under Cardoso. And when you see in 2020 to 2022, two BRICS countries in the middle, so we have Modi and Ramaphosa against intellectual property on a public good, COVID-19 vaccines and treatment. And you have Bolsonaro with the drug companies. In between are managers of the Sputnik vaccines and Sinopharm and Sinovac vaccines. Moscow and Beijing. And they wouldn't support the general public good. This is, in this way, the schizophrenia and I think the weight of the G20 towards a semi-peripheral situation. And the global value chains explain so much of this. The World Bank last November measured some of the natural capital depletion. And we don't like those two words, natural capital. There's a long theory in sustainability economics goes back to Robert Solow, John Hartwig. But I find it interesting to see that terrible negative 60% per person income between 1995 and 2020 that reflects the peripheral economies' subjugation in the global value chains as they lose their minerals and their fossil fuels, their non-renewable natural capital. And the countries that are winning from this are the ones processing at a very cheap price, most obviously China, but also Brazil, with Vale and others. And then we have the imperialist economies who grow wealthier in this process. So if you are interested not just in unequal exchange relationships, again, Marini, subsequently unequal ecological exchange helps to measure these resource flows. The bank has some problems with its methodology we can talk about, but these are conservative figures. Then we see the bigger problem in capitalism, the over-accumulation, the excess capacity, and it goes through waves. The spatial fix that David Harvey, that Neil Smith had worked on, is so evident from the 2000s when Chinese trade surpluses soar. And then comes the inevitable devalorization and the requirement for the state, which had built up a real estate bubble in the cities, and the result being both cities and Evergrande, these other real estate companies going bankrupt. Now a state-directed shift into the credit for manufacturing, which means, for example, in electric vehicles and solar panels and batteries, massive control of the world market in China. But what the West, their leaders like Janet Yellen, Biden's finance minister, or the EU leaders said, oh, you have overcapacity in China. This was about 2 years ago. You might remember Xi Jinping was being talked to in a very stern way. It was a ridiculous idea that we have overcapacity when we need so much the move to solar energy. But you get the point that capitalism cannot capture and continually reproduce a system where it overproduces. The rise in the organic composition of capital, more machines to labor is obvious with Chinese robotics. And for Brazil, for South Africa, the most disturbing process is that when Donald Trump this year puts on tariffs, then China is limited to exporting to that market. And where does it export its massive surplus? To South Africa, to Brazil. I can tell you in South Africa, the national defense mechanism is also tariffs against dumping the production below cost. So dumping by China has been named and proven very decisively by the manufacturers and the government agency, which is pro-China, but it has to admit in steel, in tires, in washing machines, in nuts and bolts, plenty of other cases. We are seeing over-accumulation of capital in China, not displaced through ordinary trade into the United States, but dumped in South Africa. And the result is, I'm sure when our statistics come out, much more rapid deindustrialization and reprimarization. Now, the biggest question for the BRICS, which was not answered here, we were disappointed, it was not answered in Kazan, the last summit in Russia in October. Can we get something to weaken the US power, especially that exorbitant privilege, that's the term that we used, exorbitant privilege to print money, quantitative easing, and the power to raise the interest rates in the US Federal Reserve. So we've been hoping for de-dollarization, we've been hoping for cyber currencies and central bank currencies and all sorts of coordination. We've seen institutions rise in many of the BRICS capitals, the kind of people who are at the height of the financial district, as Prabhat Patnaik, the Indian Marxist economist, has explained. The class formation of a financial elite means that if you do try to enter global reform, and you expect the BRICS to be somehow critical and anti-financial imperialist, you are not watching rebalance of forces. So then you've got this exciting moment. Even 2 days ago, Donald Trump yet again said that the BRICS, I taught them a lesson, don't de-dollarize. Well, I think he was right. Whether or not it's true, as Trump believes, that if you lose the dollar, it's like losing a revolutionary war. The main point is that even a Brazilian journalist, Pepe Escobar, the most eloquent in English, probably in Portuguese, Pepe Escobar reports for Sputnik. He's the most dogmatic against U.S. financial imperialism. But when he had to report on Putin's speech in Kazan, he had to admit, nothing is happening on de-dollarization. We have no intention of abandoning the dollar, said Vladimir Putin last year. And I see nothing from my friends here in Rio to suggest that what happened here in July is going to make any difference. In fact, in September 8th, Lula hosted the BRICS online. You remember he was worried about the new Trump, the August trade tariffs. So what came out of that to change the power relations? What came out of that meeting of the BRICS? Urgent emergency meeting. I see every one of you was following the meeting closely because you were correct. Nothing came out of that meeting. It was a catastrophe. We had hoped that they would agree, let us stop the genocide with boycott, divestment sanctions. But instead, not only just before Kazan, look at the blessing from 4 BRICS countries, India, UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Egypt. The blessing that we can look at the details if you want. One blessing is that South Africa is the #1 supplier of coal to the Israeli power plants. But also you are here, Petrobras, providing 9% of Israel's oil, and you have these relationships with Aldo. Let me leave the tragedy that the BRICS talk left and walk right on the most important moral question of our time, which is Israel's attacks on Palestine, where profiteers from every BRICS country except Iran have made a nonsense of what South Africa did in The Hague, which Brazil joined last month, and the Hague Group, which is Gustavo Petro in Colombia and Ronald Lamola, the South African foreign minister. They met in July in Bogota, and they did nothing to advance this question of BDS and putting pressure. Nothing. And one reason is that there has been such an effective co-optation. Gustavo Petro said last month, I will not join the BRICS because of the oil addiction of the BRICS. Right? He's trying to decarbonize. And the BRICS instead have this sort of arrangement that you see, which I think will be very important to all of our cities. Cities that become too hot to live in. Cities like Rio that face rising sea levels. Cities that undergo terrible storms. In Durban, South Africa, 500 people died in one day in 2022 because of a rainbow. And in Porto Alegre, hundreds died as well last year. Now, we have here a meeting in Copenhagen in the Climate Summit of the United Nations in 2017. Obama storms into the room, and there you see Jacob Zuma, you see Lula, Wen Jiabao, Manmohan Singh. And these are some of the worst historic polluters. And now the BRICS together have 51% of emissions, with about 35% of GDP. So I think what we see in Belém next month will be 3 central agreements. 3 agreements that the BRICS are happy to make with the G7. Well, G6, there's a G1 we'll just come back to. But the G6 that is the Western powers without Trump, and the BRICS, they all agree not to cut emissions and leave fossil fuels underground to the extent we need to in order to save the planet. This has been a very strong site of agreement since that 2009 meeting. Don't cut emissions enough. Don't leave fossil fuels underground. The second important part of the agreement between the West and the BRICS is never to admit that you emitted. You never acknowledge a climate debt. You never accept reparations, ecological reparations. And the idea called polluter pays. If you make a mess inside your country, you should clean it up, you should pay. But if you make a global mess, it doesn't matter. So denying climate debt, like Donald Trump denies climate change, but denying climate debt is respectable. It's the operative idea within the UNFCCC. Even in the Paris Climate Agreement, there's an annexure that says, if you sign here, you forgive the liability of all of the countries, the economies, the corporations that have emitted. The third crucial point, which goes back to Brazil in the early 2000s, promoting in the UNFCCC what we call the privatization of the air. Instead of cutting emissions, you sell the right to pollute through the carbon markets and through clean development mechanisms and reducing emissions through forest degradation and deforestation, all of these gimmicks. And if you want to look into the problems, all you need to see is the EU emissions trading scheme, which is the highest level of carbon pricing, and it's all over. It's like a casino, it's like a roller coaster. It drops by 50% between February 2023 and February 2024. So capitalists are not serious about using techniques of technological change or market pricing techniques, which we would call ecological modernization. And one reason is because if you can't cut emissions enough, number one, then you have no basis for the markets to work because your demand is so weak. So we have these three areas of agreements. I can guarantee you in Belém. Is anybody going to Belém? Are you working on climate? Some of you have seen the climate catastrophe in your own cities. Portugal roads is tragic. But I can guarantee you that Lula will not depart from those three crucial points that make him the leading sub-imperialist of climate, completely in tune, with one exception, which is the carbon border adjustment mechanism in Europe. We can talk about that. But basically, we have a huge problem of the imperial and sub-imperial blocks. So let me have two more slides, because I think we have to look now at the alliances that we need to build to fight, first, the paleo-conservative and the neo-conservative forces. And the paleo-conservatives obviously include Donald Trump, but Trump can also become an old-fashioned militarist, expansionist neo-conservative. The people of Iran will tell you that. The people of Venezuela will tell you that. So paleo-conservatives, the far right, MAGA, and we see them now. Obviously Bolsonaro, you talked us so much about paleo-conservative and how to fight paleo-conservative ideology. But we still have a major problem across Europe. When the G20 is hosted by Trump in the Miami Doral Country Club, he'll throw away everything. And then the hope in Johannesburg, oh yeah, that's just 1 year. Oh, just 1 year, we'll get through it. The G20 can get through it. And then we can go back to Lula's food security and taxation of the global rich and sustainability and solidarity and equality. That's what we hear in Johannesburg. Because who's hosting G20 in 2027? It's Prime Minister Nigel Farage. That's what it's going to be. You can just check the polls. And then we have the same in France and possibly the same in Germany. The rise of this racist and Islamophobic and xenophobic protectionist current. And normally, neoconservatives, we call them in the West, we call them the blob. You know that term, it's the State Department and the military-industrial complex, the Pentagon, the think tanks. I think you have heard of Naomi Klein's description of a think tank. It's a place where people are paid to think by the people who control the tanks. That goes over in Portuguese, but you know what I mean. So we have these neoconservatives. I see them fairly tight, even though rhetorically there's a huge divide. And then we've seen parts of the neoliberal agenda, especially with Elon Musk in his Department of Government Efficiency. And you might know when he cut US aid, I don't know if it hit Brazil, but the PEPFAR, the AIDS medicines, have killed, well, one estimate from the Lancet, there will be 14 million dead by 2030 because of those aid cuts in medicines, in humanitarian aid, food aid, climate aid. So those are the typical financial, techno-feudal, okay, you see them in the European Union, in the World Economic Forum, Britain, and then we have a fourth block, which we've been talking about, and we see some very powerful ideologues like Vijay Prashad and his Tricontinental, making very persuasive arguments for justice. However, when we look at what the BRICS do in reality, in their global value chains, where they take so much out of the poorest countries, Eastern DRC is a site for Chinese workers in Foxconn to make the parts of an apple. The profits, of course, all go to California. But we can unfortunately see a fairly effective alliance between the G6, Europe, the UK, Canada, Japan, with BRICS countries in trying to revive the WTO and promote the IMF. I think we have two critics of the current G20 formulation we're seeing in Johannesburg. Social democrats, Gustavo Petro, I think, leading the world, maybe Claudia Sheinbaum. The older generation in Europe and even the US, Bernie Sanders, Jean-Luc Mélenchon in France, Jeremy Corbyn in Britain, can still promote a strong social democratic worldview. Yanis Varoufakis with his Progressive International. But I think our future lies with all of you, because your understanding of the urban social movements, whether you work with an MTST or with any other groups, I think puts you in a solidaristic, eco-feminist, and racial, social, and environmental justice movement, favoring the globalization of people, promoting the deglobalization of capital, and social movements at the international scale. I mean, what better example than MST in pulling together a Via Campesina from movements of rural people all over the world. We have the old left, we have some extraordinary histories like anti-apartheid movement. My first visit here in 1993 was to stay with Solomon Lashberg and Jennifer Dernschfeld, who were the leaders of Brazil, South Africa, anti-apartheid solidarity. Fantastic. Hey, they said, Augusto Ball, come over. Hey, Ella Freire, come over. And they were so excited to talk Brazilian solidarity with South Africa. That's one of our great moments, because we won, essentially, one person, one vote in a unitary state because of the support from Rio. We've had the AIDS movement I mentioned, again Brazil, at the cutting edge of allowing people to make the demand for free AIDS medicines made generically in Rio or Sao Paulo or Johannesburg or Kampala, Uganda or Harare, Zimbabwe. The success of that movement made our life expectancy rise from 52 in 2004 to 65 just before COVID. So it's the most miraculous success of international social movements. We've seen from Porto Alegre, the World Social Forum, ups and downs. Maybe Benin next year will give it an African boost. We've seen the feminists, like World March of Women, Black Lives Matter, the biggest movement ever in the US, until tomorrow. No kings will be marching will be 10 million strong in the US tomorrow. And the urban social movements, the climate justice movement, and the liberation of Palestine. And if we think that these are all discrete single-issue movements that cannot come together, and we see, okay, Greta Thunberg, what a wonderful model of the climate justice and Palestine liberation movements, thinking outside the box. And my last slide, I have 2 more slides. We've been figuring out, can we put all of these disgruntled movements together, called bricks from below. So we've been trying, and in Fortaleza in 2014, it was more difficult in 2019, and then this year in Rio, the complications of finding critics of the BRICS when Brazil is hosting the BRICS. I think you had one small protest pro-Palestine here in Rio. We tried to have protests against the BRICS in Durban in 2013 and in Johannesburg in 2018 and 2023. And it's a great moment to think about how our cities can take forward a broader set of agendas that I think can be linked. And if you don't believe me, then you just must focus on how urban movements have risen in the last few weeks. Just a few days ago in Madagascar, last week, Tunisia, the 2 weeks before in Tunisia, 2 months before in Kenya, and then that's just Africa, Nepal, Indonesia. All of these are amazing moments to figure out whether, as Frantz Fanon put it, we have a generational opportunity for Gen Z to finally stand up and say, can't, after failure, after attempts like the World Social Forum, can't our cities and our countryside come together with a progressive response to sub-imperialism that can envision a non-dependent BRICS, a non-dependent Rio, a non-dependent Johannesburg.
Obrigado, Patrick, pela instigante palestra. A gente agora abre para as questões, né, o diálogo com o Patrick, para aqueles que quiserem fazer alguma pergunta. Está aberto. Nós temos aí algum tempo ainda para o debate. Weiner, Regis. Mais alguém?
Essa conversa aqui minha com o Patrick não está começando hoje. E as nossas divergências já são mais ou menos conhecidas. Mas eu queria dizer que temos muitos acordos também. Eu gostaria de insistir em alguns acordos que são fundamentais. E o BRICS representa uma ruptura do sistema capitalista, do sistema mundo, da economia financeira global, etc. Não é uma ruptura. É uma articulação de interesses num contexto de negociação que envolve pressões e contra-pressões. Mas o que me incomoda muito no Patrick, é a insistência no uso de algumas expressões, a meu ver, anacrônicas. Como ele sabe, em particular a noção de subimperialismo. Porque a gente teria que definir o que é imperialismo. Inclusive, para definir a China é um país imperialista, o Brasil é um país subimperialista. Na tradição do pensamento marxista, o imperialismo se define pela dominação financeira e tem como um elemento central o investimento de capital que vai se expandindo pelo mundo. Se estes são critérios, é difícil qualificar o Brasil como subimperialista. Qual é o percentual de exportação de capitais brasileiros no mundo? Eu posso procurar aqui rapidamente o dado. No Brasil, 50% do PIB é investimento estrangeiro. Mais de $1 trilhão são investimento estrangeiro no Brasil. Nos setores estratégicos da indústria, muito mais. Se a gente pegar o agronegócio brasileiro, na verdade ele não existe se não for a Bugenborn, a Cargill, a Anderson Clayton, a Louis Dreyfus, que são os grandes traders, né, de commodities de origem agropecuária. Ou seja, o grande agronegócio brasileiro também é um negócio do grande capital internacional, não do grande capital brasileiro. Eu também não sei qual é o percentual de investimento de capital sul-africano fora da África do Sul, mesmo se a gente considerar as regiões vizinhas, quer dizer, o sul da África, a África subsaariana. Qual é a presença do capital sul-africano? Eu sei da presença do capital chinês. Eu sei da presença do capital chinês no Brasil. Se a gente pegar os investimentos em infraestrutura, em energia, sobretudo as chamadas energias alternativas eólicas, os chineses estão dominando o investimento no Brasil. Então, a mim me incomoda muito que, para qualificar a posição de países como o Brasil e a África do Sul no sistema capitalista mundo, se recorra à noção de subimperialismo. Que no caso do pensador original Marini, isso ainda estava associado a outras teorias sobre superexploração do trabalho, coisa que eu acho absolutamente inconsistente teoricamente. Eu estava conversando com o Patrick que o meu primeiro trabalho com pretensões teóricas foi escrito em 1974 e foi uma crítica ao pensamento do Mauro Marini. E por acaso, uma volta da ocupação aqui, comecei a arrumar uns papéis e achei esse texto que eu tinha dado por perdido há muito tempo, só que é uma fotocópia péssima, eu estou tentando redigitalizar para poder recuperar. Mas enfim, então, eu tenho a impressão que os elementos centrais da crítica que o Patrick faz ao BRICS é fundamental, corretas. Acho que o enquadramento teórico tem alguns problemas, que são alguns deles. E, a partir daí, eu não vejo uma coerência entre a crítica que você faz ao BRICS e propor como alternativa construir o BRICS por baixo. Porque, na verdade, não se trata de construir o BRICS por baixo, se trata de construir um outro espaço-tempo do internacionalismo. Eu entendo que a sua preocupação é a construção de uma articulação internacionalista, é a nossa tradição. Mas será que o espaço de construção de um novo internacionalismo é o BRICS por baixo? Eu acho que é um anti-BRICS, e não o BRICS por baixo. Isso daí é aceitar o BRICS como espaço de construção de uma alternativa. Eu entendo a sua preocupação na luta política concreta, mas acho que com perspectiva estratégica é um suicídio, que é tentar construir uma alternativa nos marcos dados pelo próprio sistema. Coisa que você afirma, o BRICS é parte do sistema. Então vamos fazer o FMI por baixo? Why not? FMI from below? World Bank from below? Essa é a visão de uma certa perspectiva que surgiu sobretudo nos anos 90, né, da construção, da democratização do Banco Mundial, da democratização do FMI, que é exatamente a reivindicação dos países do BRICS. Então, eu vejo uma contradição como perspectiva estratégica, embora eu acho que pode ser eficaz do ponto de vista da luta política mais imediata.
Bom dia, obrigado pela palestra, eu também tenho algumas questões assim, relativas a essa caracterização de subimperialismo, particularmente em relação ao Brasil, mas também me incomoda enquadrar a China como imperialista e fazer uma associação com as práticas que a gente historicamente reconhece no imperialismo, né? A gente vê hoje a China está fazendo imperialismo na África, por exemplo, uma grande questão, que para mim não é lá uma grande questão, na medida em que a gente percebe, além de uma abordagem distinta, enfim, dos acordos que não envolvem condicionalidades como envolviam com a FMI, e muitos governantes africanos hoje saindo em defesa da participação chinesa, dos investimentos chineses no continente. No último ano, 2 anos, a gente viu muitos deles, inclusive, dando chamadas, broncas em presidentes e representantes europeus que iam lá, né, dizer o que eles tinham que fazer. Né? Então, defendendo inclusive o papel da China ali. Para o Brasil, também acho muito complicado afirmar que o Brasil é subimperialista, né, por alguns motivos. Né? Primeiro, imagino que sim, pelo certa perspectiva subimperialista, envolve uma burguesia nacional que vai exportar capitais, como o Wagner falou, né? E essa burguesia que exporta capitais, ela acaba fazendo valer a agenda do imperialismo. E assim, empiricamente isso não aconteceu no Brasil. Né? O Brasil, me parece, ele não está nem entre os 5 maiores investidores nos outros países da América do Sul, a não ser o Uruguai. Chile e Colômbia têm mais investimentos em outros países sul-americanos do que o Brasil, sabe? Então, nesse aspecto eu acho problemático. O outro aspecto também é que, frequentemente, enfim, nos encontros sul-americanos, reuniões, na diplomacia, no exercício da política externa, países sul-americanos querem que o Brasil banque vários projetos de infraestrutura e cobrem isso. Né? Um outro elemento que também me chama a atenção, nesse sentido de fazer avançar a agenda imperialista através de uma burguesia nacional, além do fato de que esses investimentos foram na verdade, no caso brasileiro, foram majoritariamente estatais. Eu lembro da discussão sobre a rota, o caminho, como chamava? A infraestrutura no sul, o IRSA, né? E tem um campo aqui, eu lembro autores no Brasil dizendo que isso era um exemplo do subimperialismo brasileiro, né, o protagonismo no IRSA, né? Mas assim, em grande medida, se fosse tão representante assim da agenda imperialista, não teria havido um movimento, né, pouco depois de destruição da engenharia brasileira, que foi a Lava Jato. Né? Então, as grandes construtoras, as grandes empreiteiras, elas não eram agente imediato ou piramidal, né, como o Marini gostava de caracterizar, porque senão os Estados Unidos não ia ter apoiado a sua destruição. Teve impactos brutais, né, calculados aí coisa de 4,5 milhões, 5 milhões de empregos. Né? E minha outra questão também é que eu acho que muitas vezes essa ideia cai num estruturalismo meio determinista, sabe? Coloca aquela lógica piramidal, a gente faz aquele papel de mediador, né, do imperialismo central, e aí os países parece que não têm uma capacidade de uma política externa autônoma e soberana, não tem capacidade de agência. Acho que a questão da agência é problemática nessa abordagem, né? Inclusive na elaboração dos seus próprios projetos nacionais, política externa, a forma como eles transitam entre as contradições do capitalismo. A China passou muito tempo na órbita do Japão, né? E aí se aproveitou. Isso serviu, em alguma medida, para, no momento posterior, né, se tornar o que a China se tornou hoje. Então, eu acho que tem várias questões, várias contradições, várias complexidades que a abordagem imperialista, particularmente ela aplicada ao Brasil, né, para mim não se sustenta empiricamente. Eu queria que você falasse um pouquinho disso. Obrigado.
Mais alguém?
Should I take those two and then we can take the next round?
Ok.
Unless it's on the same topic.
Ele pode responder primeiro e depois volta para você?
Okay. these are fantastic opportunities to do what scholars must, often assisted by activists. You know, we have a praxis epistemology on the border, but it's not a military argument. Therefore, there's not an imperial problem at the level of the full definition. And there's only one imperialist power, isn't there? The United States. 800 bases, and the NATO allies. Now, so let's put that aside, right? Nobody would think that without a military, China is a full-fledged imperialist. But let me make a deeper argument. China is not imperialist. If I gave you that impression, my apologies. China is a middleman. It is taking from your telephone the coltan and the cobalt from the children working in the mines in the Eastern Democratic Republic of the Congo. And that coltan and cobalt is transferred not to Kinshasa and then to China. It's transferred across the border to Rwanda. This is important when I come back to it. And then from Rwanda, this is the illegal outflow of minerals, very valuable minerals. Then from Rwanda it goes to Foxconn. And the workers in the cities, I'm sure you know, are the victims of the Huku migrant labor system. And in the social reproduction costs, Marini would be nodding, yeah, I can see, super exploitation. The women back home are supplying so much unpaid labor to keep those urban residents, Huku, they have no urban citizenship. And in that situation, Foxconn, a Taiwanese subcontractor to Apple, is making little bits of profit. So where do the profits go? China is not being accused of imperialism in the global value chain to make your telephone. Apple is, because Apple takes the profits from its marketing and its distribution, its research and development, its financing, its entire head office system captures the vast bulk. So some of you who like to measure flows of profit, you might know the name Michael Roberts. And flows of profit are the crucial measure where you stand in this global division. So I hope I don't give the impression that we're saying China is just like a Western imperialist having over-accumulated and now going out to Brazil, certainly to Africa. That's not the argument. The argument is that this tier structure allows Apple to have so much control that when the president of the DRC, his name is Felix Tshisekedi, last December, he got very angry. We have the richest source of minerals on earth, $24 trillion under the Eastern DRC. We get zero taxes from the Chinese mining companies because they're using Rwanda as their export site. Kigali is bubbling with smelters. It's becoming a sort of an industrial city like Johannesburg on the basis of the forward linkages for mining. Now, that means that if you want to attack the injustice of that, depletion of a non-renewable resource, pollution, and in the process, greenhouse gas emissions, who do you attack? Well, if you're Felix Tshisekedi, it's obvious. You attack Apple, and that's where he filed lawsuits. He could try in the US, but with Donald Trump, forget it. So he's filing the lawsuits in France and Belgium. I hope that makes it clear if we do military analysis and global value chain analysis, we can identify a layer of the Southern period. But you're exactly right. I should start with more than Luxembourg and Marini as my sources of inspiration, their conceptions of the layering of capitalism and the capitalist, non-capitalist, super exploitative process. We should do something much more. So my next article will go through all the characteristics, Carlos, that I've decided make a country sub-imperial, not because it's always that way, but because of its practices. I forgot to mention one practice, one sub-imperial practice. And you know what happened here in Macarena Stadium in 2014. And you know what happened in Johannesburg, Soccer City in Johannesburg in 2010. And you know what happened in Moscow in 2018. And you know what happens in Switzerland, in Zurich. There's a little team there that I would call soccer imperialists. Their name is FIFA. And they use Rio in 2014, Johannesburg in 2010, and Moscow. They use them as the sub-imperial allies to totally loot our countries, didn't they? Hey, my case is closed.
Obrigado, Patrick. Vamos para a segunda rodada, então.
Bom dia, agradeço, meu nome é Renata Bastos, sou professora aqui do IPPUR. Agradeço por relembrar o Rui Mauro Marini, eu tive o prazer de conhecê-lo, fui orientada pelo Teotônio dos Santos, então o conheci. A questão que eu gostaria de colocar é sobre a questão climática. Nós tivemos agora poucas semanas em Porto Alegre, num evento do campo de públicas, e eu preparei vários alunos para a gente refletir sobre aquela tragédia. Inclusive tem um dos pôsteres que estão ali, aqui no corredor, apresenta sobre a questão do impacto climático e a juventude. E uma das questões que a gente levantou foi a seguinte, que recentemente o secretário-geral da ONU, né, ele recebeu uma resposta da Corte Internacional de Justiça sobre os tratados assinados e sua imputação de responsabilidade. Ou seja, ele consultou, né, o secretário-geral da ONU, consultou a Corte Internacional sobre os tratados assinados e sua implantação de responsabilidade, se já é possível de ser questionada nos tribunais. A gente está à véspera da COP30. Acredito que o secretário-geral deve participar e deve sentir, né, como é que está o clima. Mas o que eu quero colocar é isso. Assinam-se acordos, inclusive nós discutimos isso também com os alunos, né, acordos internacionais de combate ao clima e inclusive no G20, em especial, né, na COP29, agora a COP30, deverá ser assinado outros acordos. E a questão é essa, como cobrar, né, que efetivamente esses acordos sejam executados. O posicionamento da ONU foi esse que eu acabei de colocar, não sei se ficou claro. Obrigada mais uma vez.
Mais alguém?
Deixa eu fazer mais uma provocação.
Então deixa eu voltar para você. Patrick, mais uma vez, obrigado. Conforme você foi falando, várias questões vieram na minha cabeça, a intervenção do Wagner levantou outras. Inclusive, achei interessante que o Wagner acabou ficando do lado do Fernando Henrique do Serra na crítica ao Marini. Mas a brincadeira. Evidentemente é uma brincadeira. Mas assim, eu acho que você falou bastante sobre a questão do subimperialismo, não tanto sobre superexploração, né? E o Regis também, quando mencionou a questão do Brasil não ser exatamente subimperialista, porque não tem tanto investimento, né, nos países vizinhos, eu vejo um pouco, assim, tem uma questão setorial, porque o Brasil, me parece, conseguiu esboçar alguma tentativa de subimperialismo, nesse sentido que ele estava mencionando, com as grandes construtoras. Quer dizer, os governos petistas tinham a ideia de criar as grandes campeãs nacionais. Essas grandes campeãs nacionais, elas, no início do século XXI, pelo menos, né, se expandiram para os países na África, né? Então a Odebrecht tem vários investimentos na África, né? Agora, realmente, ele tem razão, houve um certo desmonte aí, né, desse aparato, mas a Odebrecht avançou bastante na África e na América Latina, né? E também a gente tem uma interferência, né, dessas grandes corporações brasileiras em algumas conjunturas políticas na América Latina. Por exemplo, a relação do Odebrecht e de outros, acho que Andrade Gutierrez também, com casos de corrupção, por exemplo, no Peru, se não me engano, em outros países da América Latina, o que dá a entender que há alguma conexão, mas eu concordo com o Regis que falta essa conexão com o imperialismo, talvez.
Tem a simetria, mas não tem essa dominação.
E aí, então, portanto, eu acho que há um envolvimento da questão da superexploração, que talvez essas grandes empresas brasileiras, ao se expandirem, setorialmente falando, tá? Evidentemente não é todo o setor brasileiro que se expandiu para os outros países vizinhos e mais frágeis, mas o setor da construção e da infraestrutura com certeza, né? Isso está bem documentado. Então, o avanço da superexploração nesses países, ou seja, Bolívia, Peru, outros países africanos, né? Paraguai, a partir da atuação de grandes construtoras, de grandes empresas brasileiras, poderia estar estimulando e avançando com a superexploração desses países vizinhos. Eu estou levantando um pouco essa bola para, dialogando, né, com o que foi colocado, que talvez a própria Vânia Bambira e o Rui Marini, como estão falando lá nos anos 70 de subimperialismo, estão falando, por exemplo, do governo militar interferindo na Bolívia, no golpe da Bolívia e no golpe peruano. Então, quero colocar um pouco mais em perspectiva que há traços, mas talvez não haja traços suficientes para explicitamente ou para caracterizar tão enfaticamente que o Brasil se tornou subimperialista. Agora, do ponto de vista das relações internacionais, das relações com o BRICS e com as ideias do BRICS, a ideia da criação do BRICS, me parece que faria um pouco mais de sentido, mas essa é uma dimensão. Então eu queria chamar a atenção para outras dimensões que você não mencionou, e que também nos comentários também não foi mencionado. De um lado, a atuação em infraestrutura urbana, nos países vizinhos, a partir de grandes conglomerados brasileiros, isso falaria a favor da ideia do subimperialismo. De outro, a questão da superexploração, né, nesses países vizinhos, sendo avançada, né, também por esses grandes conglomerados brasileiros. Então, eu estou adicionando isso para dizer que eu talvez entenda a ideia do subimperialismo brasileiro, no contexto latino-americano e africano, até. Ao mesmo tempo, eu concordo com os meus colegas que falta ainda alguns elementos para completar. O Marini, quando estava falando sobre o imperialismo brasileiro, e a Vânia Bambira também, de alguma maneira, estava pensando em um projeto em construção, né, que eu acho que a ditadura militar tinha como projeto de potência regional brasileira frente aos países vizinhos, uma certa subjugação, aí sim, em nome de o imperialismo norte-americano, estadunidense, né? Então, o contexto acho que importa, e eu tenho a dificuldade de ver esse desdobramento para o contexto brasileiro. Então, eu vejo, por um lado, elementos subimperialistas ainda, como esses que eu estou mencionando. Por outro lado, eu concordo com os meus colegas que há ainda falta uma última perna para completar esse diagnóstico propriamente subimperialista. Eu queria ouvir um pouco o que você acha disso e, se você puder, dialogar um pouco mais com essa questão da superexploração, né? Que é importante, é fundamental no caso do Marini.
Yes, and the climate is maybe the best example, but that's the multilateral agenda. Before that, I think if you remember that the deindustrialization and reprimarization of Brazil and South Africa as the two worst cases, but of course Russia has a similar factor. This is a crucial explanation, Regis, for the failure of Brazilian industrial capital to do what, not just Marini, but in the open veins of Latin America, we read about the Brazilian capital is expanding. I think that crash of the manufacturing to GDP and the shift in the circuits of capital allowed two processes. So I've seen closely Odebrecht in Angola and Mozambique. I don't know their activities that got them prosecuted in Latin America. And they were appalling. They were full of the worst tendencies. It broke our hearts because Odebrecht sent with Lula and my friend Salman Flashberg in 2003 a large delegation to come to Africa to say, we love South Africa in Africa. It was heartbreaking that Vale came because their role in Mozambique can only be described in the coal fields as massive destruction. And it was unsuccessful. Both Odebrecht and Vale are failed sub-imperial expansions. And I think this is part of the reason, which is Brazilian capital has been defeated by Chinese capital. The internecine sub-imperial battles over expansion and who can bear the costs. And our manufacturing base is crashing right now. Absolute destruction because of dumping. And you could say that's Trump, yes. But the bigger story is the over-accumulation of capital. And I think that means on the climate front, there's a reluctance to devalorize carbon capital. I don't know your Brazilian power balance, but in South Africa, our coal companies and new oil and gas companies, plus very capital-intensive smelting, that is melting the minerals and processing, and heavy manufacturing, makes South Africa third highest in the world as a carbon-addicted economy per person per unit of GDP. So if you take those measures, South Africa is stuck, even though it is the poster child for the Just Energy Transition Partnership or decarbonization. That's nonsense. It's not happening. And even though we have so much sun, good wind on the coast, it's not being used as a renewable source, more than about 7%. Now, that means when we look at a COP30, we look at the balance of forces, notwithstanding some rhetoric, we desperately need what you said, because the BRICS and the West are completely together. Do not cut emissions enough to save the planet. Do not admit that you emitted. No climate debt. And let's privatize the air. If I've got that wrong, you're watching COP30, please let me know. My impression is that Lula stands proudly sub-imperial in those three ways. But you just said something crucial. There is in the United Nations, in the International Court of Justice, a small opening on July 23rd. 27 children from Vanuatu, a small island in the Pacific, it's sinking. The children said, stop. Somebody must pay and have a disincentive so that we don't have the destruction of our society. And the International Court of Justice last December held hearings. Result did not look good. None of the BRICS endorsed these children. None of the West did. Okay, England, but you know, British people. Not reliable, two-faced. And so the problem, I think, for that particular case, the children of Vanuatu versus the polluters, they won, but it's an advisory opinion. So I'm curious, it should be earth-shattering. My second of the allegations, that the West and the BRICS together will not accept climate debt. If I'm wrong about this, tell me. But I'm sure Lula says, no, Paris Climate Agreement, no liability. And that means that in Brazil, if you had a society and a climate justice movement as strong as the conditions demand, every newspaper on July 24th would have blasted out, Brazil must pay. But none of them did. None of them in South Africa did. This is a terrible secret that there is polluter pays liability. And because it's a secret from your society, nobody is going to Belém knows what we're talking about, right? None of your social movements are saying, hey, July 23, International Court of Justice. And that's what we have to do as educators and as people who care about future generations. It's to exactly say, there is a moral component that was codified in law. We do have a climate debt. And once you get that, now the best thing that's just happened is that the most reactionary elements in the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. The US State Department, they're pulling out. They still send some delegations. But do you remember when there was Brexit, 2016? Guys like Peter Mandelson, who's he? Yeah, you know him. He was the EU leader from Britain. And when in 2016, Brexit, now my friends in Britain, they were very unhappy, they were very angry. My friends in Brussels, in Paris, and in Berlin, and in Amsterdam, they were cheering because they know they can move much faster without the Brits. So I hope that's something you'll keep in mind. First, that not only do we need to boycott, divestment, sanctions, Israel, but also fossil fuel companies. We need to really find ways to make the polluter pay at the source, the Scope 3 emission source. But we also need a world boycott against Donald Trump. And that began in Canada. They don't like the bourbon from Tennessee anymore. You can't find it on the shelves in Canada. You can't find a Tesla dealership without broken windows. You see the personal wealth of Elon Musk. He grew up in Johannesburg. Okay, we're very, very sorry. We did give you Trevor Noah. Okay, he's laughing because he knows that's a good deal. We gave you Tyler, the great young singer. She just won 3 Grammys. We gave you Charlize Theron, outrageously appreciate. But we are very sorry for Elon Musk. So when there's a boycott of X.com and the Tesla stocks are crashing, and Elon Musk loses $100 billion of his personal wealth, that's a signal, isn't it? BDS USA. And I think at the level, ultimately, of changing the power relations, it is actually naming and shaming. What worries me the most, though, is that when we look at the different forces ideologically, I can see in the climate scene, especially here, with BRICS, with the G7, and with our climate justice movement, I can see the coalition in Berlin holding strong. And I've sat in on lots of Zoom calls with our comrades who do climate justice, and we're not prepared to make this kind of alliance against this. At the same time, this is becoming irrelevant to policy, although obviously crucial for destruction. And I hope this sort of politics can trump, can defeat those forces who are the Belen. And Lula is right there, right? And I hope all of you, dear comrades, you have that clearly in your mind and in the soul of your next generations.
Ok.
Eu queria justamente provocar você sobre este slide. Você coloca o Trump fora do neoliberalismo. Eu acho que é a coisa mais complicada. Eu acho que esse é o problema. Você está preso, stuck, em algumas categorias analíticas que não dão conta da realidade contemporânea e das mudanças pelo que passa o sistema mundo capitalista. O Trump, se você olhar para dentro dos Estados Unidos, é absolutamente neoliberal. A destruição do aparelho, se você pegar os pontos centrais do consenso de Washington, o elemento central é a destruição da presença do Estado na vida econômica, social, cultural. O neoliberalismo não é um projeto apenas econômico, é também um projeto cultural, ideológico, etc. A volta ao indivíduo e à família. Então, do ponto de vista da política interna estadunidense, absolutamente neoliberal. Mas neoliberal é uma maneira tática, usar o poder de Estado para impor a destruição da esfera pública. Não é à toa que a Thatcher era neoliberal, mas ela dava de ferro. Ou seja, o neoliberalismo tem uma conotação autoritária profunda e originária. Então, olhando desse ponto de vista, ele é neoliberal a fundo. Olhando do ponto de vista da política de comércio internacional, não. que a política de comércio internacional, do consenso de Washington, propunha o fim das fronteiras, a livre circulação de mercadorias e capitais. Quem é que é o liberal do ponto de vista da política internacional? O Brasil, a China. O Brasil agora é defensor do livre comércio. Os nacionalistas dos anos 50 e 60 eram protecionistas. E o Brasil hoje é defensor do livre comércio. Tradicionalmente, aí você teria razão, os países imperialistas são favoráveis ao livre comércio. A livre circulação de capitais, etc. Mas o Trump aceita a livre circulação de capitais, mas na verdade ele quer atrair investimento estrangeiro nos Estados Unidos. Se isso vai dar certo ou não, pouco me interessa. Eu estou falando da configuração das ideologias. Então, colocar o Trump como neoconservador, eu acho um equívoco. Primeiro, do ponto de vista de uma série de elementos, ele não se diferencia da ultradireita, do urbano, etc. Ele é absolutamente aliado das questões relativas à moralidade, à família, etc. Absolutamente da extrema-direita. Nesse sentido, neoliberal, respeito ao indivíduo, à opção individual, o fim da intervenção do Estado, embora usando. Então, e multipolar. O que é multipolaridade? Fala sério, entendeu? Você, como um teórico qualificado, você sabe que desde o final do século XIX já se formulou a ideia de que o desenvolvimento do capitalismo é desigual e combinado. É óbvio que você acha que puxa isso para subimperialismo, mas eu acho que o conceito é da desigualdade combinada da forma como se organiza a economia mundial, o sistema mundial, etc. O que é multipolaridade? Eu deve ter mais votos no FMI, isso é multipolaridade. O Brasil participar do Conselho de Segurança da ONU. Vamos reformar a ONU. Os americanos saíram da Organização Mundial da Saúde, saíram da Unesco. A OMC saiu da Organização Mundial da Saúde, a Organização Mundial do Comércio, que era um dos esteios do acordo da pós-segunda guerra, está sendo destruído. Não existe mais a Organização Mundial do Comércio, vamos combinar. Acabou a Organização Mundial do Comércio. Então, evidentemente, deixando de lado a questão militar, e eu concordo com você, desse ponto de vista, país imperialista é os Estados Unidos. E subimperialista seria o quê? A França, que tem nuclear próprio. Mas do ponto de vista da configuração dos campos ideológicos, políticos em disputa, eu acho que essa classificação peca pela dificuldade de entender o que é essa nova direita trumpista, ou também a direita do governo indiano. O que é a Índia? Entendeu? Ideologicamente é multipolar, aspirante à multipolaridade, é um governo fascista. Eu não posso usar o termo fascista. É um governo de extrema-direita, xenófobo, racista. Então, eu acho que temos um problema aí de qualificação das novas formas que a dominação assume e que não podem ser remetidas a formas anteriores. Nem a fascismo, meu ver, não é uma forma adequada de qualificar o que se passa, mas também não é conservador, neoconservador. Acho que isso daí não é normalmente é difícil, né? Você não encontrou a qualificação para dizer o que aquilo é. Então você recorre a alguma coisa que já houve para dizer que é parecido com o que já houve. Mas parecido com o que já houve não qualifica o que é. E acho que a gente ainda não tem uma qualificação do que é essa extrema-direita que cresce de maneira internacional e hoje tem o poder na Itália, em vários países europeus e agora nos Estados Unidos, mas com configurações singulares em cada país. Eu queria provocar você sobre isso, sobre o uso do conceito neoliberal, o uso do conceito conservador. Você vai fazer a pergunta?
Como é que é seu nome?
Bom dia, meu nome é Elise. Eu sou estudante de doutorado aqui. Se eu entendi certo, numa ecologia internacional, né? Na integração dos povos com base nesse princípio de solidariedade, né? E globalização dos povos e dos mercados. Hoje de manhã eu li um artigo do Zizek falando que, ironicamente, nos Estados Unidos pode ser que o exército ele seja crucial no ato de frear as maluquices do Trump. E nós vivemos num mundo de pós-verdade, que é muito difícil argumentar com bases científicas para convencer as pessoas dessa crise climática. Então, acho que, assim, no geral, as pessoas elas ficam muito desnorteadas, assim, e é muito comum que se acredite que, por exemplo, se eu substituir um copo plástico por um canudinho de papelão, as coisas vão melhorar. Substituir a caneta de plástico por uma caneta também de papelão, enfim. Então, eu me pergunto se dá tempo, diante das transformações intensas que a gente tem vivenciado, de pensar em estratégias de políticas de retaliação, de políticas conservadoras, xenófobas, extremistas, como a do Trump. Dá tempo? E também, ironicamente, será que não teria que armar a população? Assim, será que não pode existir uma barbárie antes mesmo dessa tomada de consciência global? Porque acho que o que está em pauta é um senso de solidariedade ecológica internacional. Só que é muito difícil isso em tempos de inteligência artificial e de fake news. Então, assim, às vezes eu fico pensando, será que um dos meios de frear tudo isso que a gente vive, essa catástrofe, não seria, ironicamente, pelas vias bélicas, assim? Às vezes até eu fico pensando na Revolução Francesa, que às vezes a gente teria que guilhotinar mesmo os bilionários, assim, essas coisas, esses atos mais extremos, né? Enfim, essa é a pergunta.
It's fantastic. I think they are interrelated because Carlos says that we've got a problem with fascistic neoliberals, Modi and Bolsonaro and Putin, who have also neoconservative, culturally reactionary perspectives. Yes, these are intermixed. So this is a political superstructure, and Carlos doesn't think it's nuanced enough. So I invite you, make some other categories. You don't like neo this, that's good. That's the interplay we need. However, what you're describing is so difficult because all of these four agree not to cut emissions, not to pay a climate debt, and to privatize the air. All of these, except they disagree there's a climate crisis, but that basic problem in the dilemma. Your question then, if this is a very adverse balance of forces, where it mixes of brutal capitalism, brutal racism, brutal sexism, the xenophobia that's so consistent in this rise of the far right, how do we come forward with any solidaristic work? So here's what I think I find inspiring in this work. There's a technical approach which we take to the courts. The ICJ is one place, but even in South Africa, with a conservative court system, with the private property rights, we're winning on the courts with lots of interesting arguments. Some of them are rights of future generations, which is a field from the Brundtland Commission on Sustainable Development, 1987, that even in Massachusetts Institute of Technology, in the 1970s, Robert Solow and John Hardwick events. So we can go technical, head-to-head with our enemy, with neoliberals, because they have a claim, don't they? The neoliberal claim is that if you have the right market incentives, you can internalize the externalities, like pollution. Which brings me to the biggest problem they have and the biggest opportunity we have. And theirs is that they may claim technological change, replacing fossil fuels with solar, or creating some magical system to put particles in the air to stop the sun from hitting hard, or putting iron filings into the ocean so that there's algae blooms, and the carbon sequestration, that is, the carbon is captured and the algae sinks to the bottom. The ocean is, absolutely a great sink if we put iron filing. Or carbon capture and storage, where you take your coal-fired power plants and you suck the CO2 underground. These are some of the, or you know them here from Plantar. You produce gum trees, eucalyptus trees, imported from Australia to sequester the carbon. That's your biggest CDM still, right? Plantar. And then you forget there are forest fires. There are incredibly dry conditions, so this tree planting doesn't work. So the technical fixes are not happening. Yes, there's more solar, of course. It's cheaper. But what I think is our greatest opportunity is the new research on the damage done, what we would call a carbon tax requirement, to stop me flying tomorrow to Johannesburg without paying at least, how much should I pay? You comrades gave me a beautiful economy flight in Latam. I'm grateful. But that flight, I think, was only 1/3 of the cost of what it should have been if we had a carbon tax in Brazil or South Africa. Now, what should this number be? If you ask a neoliberal, well, let's find the social cost of carbon. You can ask Donald Trump, he says $1 per ton. If you ask Joe Biden, $187 from his EPA's Environmental Protection Agency. So we're now talking to the people at Stanford University, at Northwestern University. Their names are Adrian Bilal and Diego Kenzig. And they work for the National Bureau of Economic Research. And last month, their newest report on what the internalizing of the externality, that is the social cost of carbon, the damage being done, is now $1,584 per ton. $1,584 per ton in a cost-benefit analysis. Okay, your planners, you know what I mean. You go to an environmental impact assessment hearing, you say, here's my costs, $1,484 a ton. Then that project is finished. So we're actually winning those cases now. We're beginning to say to the fossil fuel companies, when you start doing ecological modernization properly, then you are actually with climate justice. Climate justice, they don't like me counting the value of nature. Nature is priceless. You can't put any kind of contingent valuation. You can't make polluters pay properly. And we say, but, wait a minute, climate justice has always, since Acción Ecológica from Quito, Ecuador, came to Rio in 1992, right? These young eco-feminists from Ecuador, and they said, but the West, you've polluted too much. You must pay the climate debt, an ecological debt, it started with. You might know Jean Martinez Allier from Barcelona. He's the guru on liabilities for destruction of nature. So we have a dialectic in process between climate justice, environmental justice movements. By the way, where do you find them? ejatlas.org. And there are 1,000 Brazilian cases. Some of them you've all worked with. Beautiful struggles from the base. And it's the networking of those struggles. Because when I was here in 2012 for Rio Plus 10, Plus 20, do you remember that year? It's too young for you. Okay. In 2012, we had 10,000 people at Vale headquarters. You were there. I saw you throwing eggs at Vale. The linkage of our movements. Okay, you're a little young. The linkage
Not
of our,
eggs.
Not, oh, were you doing this stuff? You found some eggs filled with blood.
Yeah, I remember.
Yeah.
But I wasn't throwing them.
Okay, so that is the strategic terrain we have to link these forces, to find sites where if I see an anti-extractivist who's lying down in front of a coal mining truck that's trying to get out, and this is happening all the time in South Africa. They're lying down, sometimes they get run over. Tuesday, the assassination of another one of our anti-mining leaders. It's terrible. This is many, but you in Brazil know this very well. But they do bring forward, I think, the best traditions. And they have a slogan, the right to say no. They're anti-extractivists. And the link between defense of their local terrain and the potential for a global anti-extractivism. In the north, they call it degrowth. In various southern sites, we have all sorts of, the Ecuadorian term, Sumakose, or Wenvivir, or you know these movements. And I think there is something in the dialectic between that force and the technicists who, like all of you, can identify a cost-benefit analysis when the social cost of carbon is $1,584, according to bourgeois neoliberals, not a Marxist. The bourgeoisie will admit if they do these studies. In fact, even in London, one of our friends has done a study at $3,000 a ton. So to me, that would be one of your future engagements that can help to shift mindsets. When I see a Greta Thunberg, not just in Palestine on the Samud Freedom Plateau, but when I saw her in October 2023, I was in Germany then, and the contrast between German Fridays for Future and somebody like Greta who can link the issues and say, until Palestine is free, we can't do climate work with the full force of our moral potential. And the Germans, they said, no, we support Israel, and we were nasty to them, and we killed them. And you could just see the split in our CJ forces over whether they were willing to make these linkages. I'll go with Greta, and I think those, let me say, moral exemplars that stand out and they say to the world, we actually can put issues together in a social justice, environmental justice, anti-racist, anti-imperialist framework. And probably you're at the end, is that right?
Yes.
So can we use the two words? Because when you come to South Africa, if you pay your carbon tax, if you come to South Africa, the two words we need are Amandla.
Mandela.
Aware. Amandla, power. Aware. Amandla. Amandla. Aware. Amandla. 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 Aware to Amandla. Equal. Thank you.
Obrigado, Patrick. E, enfim, apesar das divergências, acho que tem mais convergências que divergências no quesito internacionalismo. Definitivamente, acho que é um pouco a ideia da palestra, né? E acho que a gente tem uma necessidade, e outros aqui, colegas, concordam, né? De situar melhor, né, a situação, a questão urbana e regional brasileira dentro do contexto internacional. Então, também tem um pouco essa dimensão aqui da palestra de encerramento. Então, mais uma vez, agradecer ao Patrick por vir lá de Joanesburgo para falar com a gente e trazer algumas dessas questões para o nosso debate. Agora a gente está no momento de fazer o encerramento, né? E antes de mais nada eu queria fazer uma saudação, um agradecimento enorme, e que na verdade eu não vou poder listar nomes, porque de fato eu vou cometer algumas injustiças, né? Então, eu queria agradecer a toda a comissão organizadora que se dedicou quase que 24 horas para que essa semana acontecesse.
Eu acho que tem um pessoal para ir.
Eu achei até que já tivesse todo mundo aqui. Pode entrar todo mundo, pessoal. Isso a gente já tinha combinado. Tá, enquanto o pessoal entra, então assim, tá. Então eu vou aproveitar enquanto o pessoal está entrando, antes de fazer essa fala, e vou anunciar os vencedores do concurso de pôsteres. Né? Tivemos o concurso de pôsteres que é tradicional do Semana IPPUR, né? E nós temos aqui, a partir do comitê avaliador de pôsteres, né? Foi formado pela professora Renata Antão, pelo Lucas Dias, que é o doutorando, e a Inara Cabral, que é a mestranda, né? E nós temos como menção honrosa, né, o pôster Expressão Espacial da Proximidade Político-Partidária dos Representantes Municipais da Região Metropolitana do Rio de Janeiro em relação ao Governo do Estado, de autoria de Luísa Leal Ávila e Levi Macedo Moreira de Freitas. Parabéns. Estão aí? Não. Como terceiro colocado do concurso, o trabalho Revista Versus, Raízes Culturais, de Nayane Cristina de Souza. Parabéns. Segundo colocado do concurso, Alertas e Lançadores de Alertas, a visibilidade da mídia na extração de sal-gema em Maceió, 1970-1990, de Daiane Alves da Silva. E na primeira colocação, o pôster Saneamento Básico em Áreas Precárias do Rio de Janeiro, o caso da Serra da Misericórdia, de Milene Vicente da Silva Moreira. Então, parabéns a todos. Todos foram agraciados com livros produzidos pelo IPPUR e pelos diferentes professores do IPPUR, também um prêmio tradicional, né? Eu quero mencionar que, independente de quem foi premiado ou não, todos os apresentadores de pôsteres foram também agraciados com livros do professor Robert Peckman, que foi homenageado aqui na cerimônia de abertura da semana, né? Então, mais uma vez, agradecer a todos que fizeram as submissões, né? Esse é um momento muito importante para os discentes, claro, né? Porque é um momento também de reconhecimento do trabalho de vocês na passagem por essa instituição. Bem, mas todos que estão aqui nesse turno, né, de trabalho da comissão organizadora, que trabalhou incansavelmente para fazer acontecer com um custo humano muito alto, né, para que tudo acontecesse, porque eu quero compartilhar, claro que não dá para, né, tem um diário da Semana IPPUR, que não dá para compartilhar tudo, mas eu posso compartilhar com vocês um certo drama que vivemos, que tem a ver com, enfim, os assuntos que foram tratados aqui ao longo da semana, principalmente a questão do subfinanciamento da Universidade Brasileira, né? Eu quero trazer alguns dados para vocês. Eu acho que isso é relevante até para valorizar ainda mais o trabalho de toda a comissão organizadora. Então vamos lá. O nosso orçamento CAPES do PAEP, né? Programa de Apoio a Eventos do País, para esse ano foi 5 vezes menor do que o do ano passado para a Semana IPPUR. Semana IPPUR do ano passado contou com praticamente R$50 mil, e esse ano nós contamos com R$10 mil. Então, por aí vocês já veem que há um problema, né, de subfinanciamento evidente. Isso nos fez ter que recorrer a outras fontes orçamentárias que não são tão usualmente utilizadas, né? E isso causou um desgaste enorme, e a gente tem que agradecer aqui também, muito enfaticamente, a direção, né, e a coordenação da pós-graduação, que fizeram esse esforço junto ao CCJE, né, a outras instâncias, para conseguir cobrir, na verdade, esse rombo orçamentário, essa é a verdade. Então, agradecer especialmente ao Regis, que atua diretamente junto com o CCJE e com a superintendência do CCJE, né, para conseguir, na verdade, recurso para tradução. Nós, até os 49 do segundo tempo, não sabíamos se teríamos recurso para cobrir tradução simultânea que não fosse desses R$10.000.
Contratamos na sexta para começar na segunda.
Contratamos na sexta-feira para começar na segunda, por razões totalmente alheias às nossas capacidades, ou seja, nós não tínhamos a possibilidade de interferência direta nesse processo burocrático, e sofremos bastante com isso. Não estou aqui culpabilizando ninguém do CCJE, a gente também sabe que o próprio CCJE não tem condições de dar conta de tanta demanda, né? Ainda mais uma nova demanda, de certa forma, criada. Diga.
Merece um agradecimento por ter nos achado.
Merece um agradecimento. A Alessandra, né? Ela conseguiu viabilizar, né, esse pagamento da tradução simultânea antes que o evento acontecesse, que seria uma loucura, né? Então, isso precisa ser dito. E agradecer mais uma vez a direção e a coordenação da pós. Agora, isso não é suficiente nesse quadro de adversidade da Universidade Pública Brasileira, porque, além disso tudo, tivemos uma demanda inédita, dialogando com a sessão de encerramento, onde Wagner, Fred, Fânia estavam falando, né, da necessidade de manter esse legado, de manter esse diálogo, de manter a relação constante entre os professores dessa instituição, para além do corredor, né, para além do pátio, né, eu tenho certeza que a gente conseguiu fazer isso nessa Semana IPPUR, né? Inclusive vários colegas vieram me falar que legal, conheci o trabalho do meu colega, que não tinha conhecido, vamos trocar, vamos dialogar. Então eu acho que essa missão foi cumprida, e com o agravante de que, ao estimularmos ao máximo esse diálogo, aumentamos também a demanda da Semana IPPUR. Então, falei da questão do orçamento, agora eu vou falar da questão da demanda. Porque na Semana IPPUR do ano passado tivemos 54 trabalhos inscritos em sessões temáticas. Esse ano tivemos 137. Então, algo, né, que demonstra o que a gente viu nos corredores, né? Salas lotadas, corredor vivo, com as pessoas conversando, trocando, né? Agora, isso, como eu disse, né, o custo humano, como a Carla bem lembrou, incansável, não, cansável. Estamos todos, de certa forma, bastante penalizados por conta dessa conjuntura que eu mencionei aqui. Eu acho importante trazer isso, porque nós teremos a Semana IPPUR de 2026. Então, precisamos pensar nos novos desafios que foram criados a partir desse novo cenário. Eu considero um novo cenário, considero que é inviável, inclusive, em certo sentido, a comparação com a Semana IPPUR do ano passado. Porque estamos numa outra escala de atuação agora, né? E com esse subfinanciamento. Então, vamos precisar nos desdobrar novamente. E eu espero que o próximo coordenador da comissão da Semana IPPUR não tenha que passar por o que eu passei e o que todo mundo passou aqui. Estou vendo as carinhas, né? Eu realmente não vou falar os nomes, vocês sabem, né? Que todo mundo abraçou para si o evento. Eu acho que isso é fundamental. Isso mostra uma configuração de corpo também, né? Todo mundo entendeu que esse evento é também o seu evento. E por isso todo mundo se doou e se dedicou tanto. Então, eu queria enfatizar, né, a bravura de todos os alunos da especialização, do mestrado e do doutorado na construção desse evento, em todo esse cenário de adversidade, e pedir uma salva de palmas para todos. Claro, o resto quer dar uma palavra.
Então, só para ver se a gente fica um pouco mais tranquilo, né? A gente recebeu essa demanda e essas informações da coordenação da semana. E, enfim, conversa com a direção. A gente sabe que agora saiu um edital CAPES, PAEP, e deve sair agora uma FAPERJ. Então a gente achou por bem, né, indicar a Carla Hirt, que faz parte da comissão desse ano, ela se dispôs, na verdade, a propor esses editais para que a gente já comece a fazer isso com um ano de antecedência,
ver se a nossa situação, provavelmente deve ter algum outro edital no início do ano que vem, então para ver se a nossa situação para a semana do ano que vem fica um pouquinho mais confortável. É isso, velho.
Maravilha, obrigado, Regis, mais uma vez, pelo apoio. Dizer, e também, assim, alguns esclarecimentos necessários. Muitas pessoas ficaram, enfim, interessadas, inclusive o nosso professor Carlos Weiner também, nas famosas camisetas da Semana IPPUR. Então, assim, nós fizemos um esforço, né, de uniformização que eu acho que teve um impacto visual interessante. Mas é claro que, diante dessa, agora que vocês estão sabendo melhor, dessa adversidade orçamentária, não temos dinheiro para novas camisas. Mas certamente temos já, né, ali o contato estreitado, né, com o nosso fornecedor. Então, para quem se interessar, a gente pode depois passar uma lista aí para adquirir, né, e ajudar também na própria, talvez até no financiamento da nova Semana IPPUR, quem sabe, né? Então, a gente depois passa para vocês aí uma lista para vocês, enfim, se inscreverem na criação dessa memória, né? Assim como a bolsa também, que eu acho que deu certo, muita gente reclamando que não tinha mais bolsa, por conta dessa enorme demanda e da frágil condição orçamentária, algumas pessoas, principalmente os ouvintes, né, ficaram sem bolsas. Então eu quero esclarecer que esse é o motivo, mas, enfim, para quem quiser, realmente estiver interessado em novas bolsas, a gente pode depois passar essa mesma lista para, enfim, depois vocês adquirirem, né? E é isso, pessoal. Então, mais uma vez, agradecer a todos, dizer que agora nós vamos para a nossa confraternização lá no Café Tuia, lá na Manuel Congo, na Cinelândia, né? Onde nós teremos feijoada e entrada pela Rua Evaristo da Veiga, bem lembrado, obrigado, né? Lá na Cinelândia, mas a entrada pelo Evaristo da Veiga, e nós temos aí, então, um momento de um pouco mais para a comissão, principalmente, relaxar um pouco, se divertir um pouco depois de tanto trabalho, mas não só, evidentemente, para a comissão, mas para todo mundo. Então, espero todos vocês lá para a gente fazer essa celebração dos 30 anos da Semana IPPUR. 30 anos não consecutivos, né? 30 anos espaçados.